Book report on Dibs in Search of Self by Sydney Walker. Book summary. The book I chose to do my book report over was Dibs in Search of Self, written by Virginia M. Axline, the renowned, deeply moving story of an emotionally lost child who found his way back. After Miss Axline's life with writing Dibs in Search of Self, and along with her other books and studies, she lived to be 77 and lived a relatively quiet life. You wouldn't see her in the street and assume she was this major theorist. She tended to stay to herself and lived her life as peacefully as she liked. She was a teacher and a professor during her time. She taught at several different colleges and spoke on her own studies and her research, but also had a deep appreciation for the English arts. She was an author and wrote Dibs in Search of Self, and along with some others, also based around Dibs and her studies with him. She was a counselor, so she actively practiced counseling after developing her theories, and she was a theorist. She worked primarily alongside Carl Rogers, who, as we know, developed person-centered therapy. So along with him, she also developed child-centered play therapy. So play therapy initially came from Virginia M. Axline's inspiration and studies. She is the person who published Play Therapy. It is a book and a theory on the importance of what play therapy can do for a child. The summary of the book. This book is written from the perspective of the play therapist. The book follows the progress of a boy named Dibs and his family. Primarily, his mother shows up the most, along with her, his father, and he has an older sister that comes into the narrative at some point. Each chapter is structured around one session for Dibs. Dibs is a young boy that has two primary extreme reactions: loud tantrums or quiet and uncertain direction. So it appears throughout the story that Dibs has big, loud reactions to everyday situations, such as being able to go home with his mother after school, and also has really quiet moments where he's unable to engage with his peers or answer direct questions from, say, a teacher or his mother. The question is posed in the beginning: is Dibs highly intelligent, or does he have an intellectual developmental disorder? In this book, it emphasizes the lack of understanding and how easy it would have been for Dibs to slip through the cracks because it was assumed by most, several of his teachers and his mother, that in reality he just was unable to think. But he had one teacher who really spoke up for him and got him connected to a psychologist and a counselor because she felt that if he was deemed to have a intellectual developmental disability, that it would not be accurate because she had seen him flourishing and understanding more complex narratives. It is discovered that Dibs in fact is intelligent, but is not emotionally educated or in touch with his fears, thoughts, and identities. So throughout the book, we see that Dibs does understand, he just is not able to communicate what is going on with inside him and does not have a voice that he feels can be trusted. Throughout the process of play therapy, Gibbs begins to recover his self awareness, self actualization, fears, relationships, and ability to communicate. Relevance to the work with children, adolescents, and/or families. Strength for a professional counselor. The first thing that I noticed throughout this book is that the counselor really emphasized mirroring. She very often would not project any sort of idea towards Dibs for fear that he would resort back into his shell. So instead, she would reiterate what he told her to emphasize that she was listening and that she understood. She also used a lot of clarifying questions, such as repeating what he said and then saying, "Is that right?" I found that to be very valuable, and his response was always, "Yes," and such and such. She also modeled patience. I felt that, especially with working with children, she offered a unique patience that he had not been offered with any of his teachers or with his parents, simply because they didn't understand what to do with the patients. She also modeled paraphrasing. This was one that she used very sporadically and did not use it super heavily so that he could speak in his own words, but she would use it to help him identify or more clearly communicate what he was feeling. She also models unconditional positive regard. She worked very well at allowing him to just be himself and that that was okay. She immediately, when he came into the room, gave him permission to do whatever he needed to do, to touch whatever he needed to touch, and to experience the world around him safely. Weakness for a professional counselor. I did feel that a weakness from this book that could have been better communicated was preparation for a child who doesn't budge. I felt that in the beginning we did see how his teachers were unable to get him to communicate, but it felt like it moved very quickly into Dibs being able to communicate and to be able to share insight into his own world. Whereas I feel like in some cases, children likely take more time than one session or two sessions to begin to verbally communicate. The second was preparation for a child who is resistant in answers such as "I don't know" or "Why do you keep repeating what I say?" I think a lot of times with children, their favorite answer is to say, "Well, I don't know. I don't know," simply because they haven't ever been encouraged to think in a certain way. And so when they are challenged to do so, some of them can become defensive and resort back to the question of why are they being assumed to have an answer. And then also the frustrations of a child or a adolescent being concerned with mirroring if too much of it is done. I do think that sometimes it can become redundant and discouraging to a child to feel like they're always being the one to add to the conversation. Questions left unanswered or posed. The only question that really stuck with my mind was how did she conclude that he was ready to be done with play therapy when there still unresolved issues? The only reason I thought this was because I found it unique that after the summer was over, it appeared so with his counseling. even though he had some unresolved feelings towards his father, as well as was developmentally delayed in several different areas due to not being able to engage for such a long time. I thought it was interesting that he would not be able to continue after the summer, even though he was given an additional appointment. Relevance to the course, Counseling 6341, Counseling Children, Adolescents, and Families. How is this book relevant to the course? This book absolutely aligns with the curriculum taught, as evidenced by the supporting material from Kress, written in 2019. Kress writes, youth ages 2 through 7 do not have abstract reasoning abilities or highly developed problem-solving skills. At this age, youth tend to express themselves and explore their world through play. Counselors should take note that children's play in early adolescence can be interpreted to indicate real-life struggles. The toys that youth select are often symbolic of people and objects in their actual lives, and play scenarios often represent their real-life dilemmas. Through play, youth will often devise concrete solutions to such problems, and counselors can work with parents, teachers, and other significant individuals to support more sophisticated and complex versions of these resolutions in real life. The reason that this particular paragraph stuck out to me in relation to this book is that oftentimes we do see how Dibs' play during his therapy related to his internal struggles at home, such as he had little green army men and he would bury those into the sand as a form of punishment. Not that this was something that happened to him, but this was something that he was able to express his frustrations with his father being emotionally unavailable. There also was a correlation between a situation where Dibs had built a mountain of sand and placed a little rubber duck on top of it. And when he returned, he was frustrated that the sand mound and the duck had no longer been there. This showed an insight that Dib's reality had a lack of control, and he felt that he didn't have control in his own life, similar to how he did not have a say that the duck was going to be moved. Personal thoughts. What I was hoping to learn. I went into this book truly not being certain of what I was going to learn, and more just excited to see what the possibilities had for me. I will say that I was hoping to find a realistic account for working with a child who doesn't want to engage. That has always been a concern for me, being as someone who currently works with adults. I am used to adults not wanting to engage, but with children, there feels like an extra layer of vulnerability, and this is something that is foreign to me in that I don't work with children. The second thing, it was balancing parental involvement in the therapeutic process. I found it really interesting how the counselor was able to manage balancing Dibs's progress with his mother's progress. I didn't think that she was presented with many complications with a parent's over involvement, but I did find that it would have been interesting to learn how to handle that when a parent asks something that they don't have a need to know. The last thing I was hoping to learn was how would I fit in the role of a children's counselor? This was something that I really wanted to hone in on and picture myself in that setting and how would I have reacted to each scenario and what could I learn and what could I be better at as a future counselor. What I liked about this book. I found that this book was realistic in many different areas, such as a mom feeling hopeless and just kind of lost as to what to do, as well as having a child who has everything but emotionally seems unavailable. I thought that it was honest. It was a honest and authentic book for a counselor's internal dialogue of what should I say here? Should I do this? How would I react? That to me was very valuable. It also was difficult to process at times. There was times where I found myself questioning and thinking, if I was in that situation, I don't know that I would have handled that correctly or in the best and most beneficial way for Dibs. I also felt that it was well rounded in terms of roles in a child's life. I felt that it really pinpointed each of the people who have the most influence on a child at this time. It talked about the role of the mom and the dad and the counselor and the sister, as well as the teachers that were involved, and at one point the aunts and uncles that are involved. And I felt that it was well rounded as to what each person can offer a child. It also was a pretty emotional book. I felt that there were times where Dibs worked through some very difficult things and was able to be vulnerable, and that was new for him. And I felt that it was a true breakthrough, whether or not it was fictional. I also enjoyed witnessing and reading the patience of the counselor. I reiterated this before, but I feel that patience is something that can truly make or break a therapeutic relationship. And a lot of times in our society, most people are lacking in patience. And so that is something that we need from each other, and especially in the therapeutic space. What I disliked about this book. I did feel as though Dibs had big leaps of progress that were made very quickly. Um, I found that it was sometimes not terribly realistic of Dibs to show such drastic progress from chapter to chapter. Even though it is very possible for that to happen, I don't know that that would always be the case. Dibs also very rarely answered questions with "I don't know," which would feel more realistic to me in my experience with children. I find that kids oftentimes, especially in the beginning when they're not taught to be very critical thinkers, that they will often resort to just shutting down and stating, "I don't know," and hoping that the conversation will move on and change. Is this information that I will take with me moving forward as a professional counselor? In the first few chapters, there's a quote that stood out to me. He did have to go back to his home no matter how he felt about it. To avoid facing this reality factor would not help him. He needed to develop strength to cope with his world, and that strength had come from within him, and he had to experience personally his ability to cope with his world as it was. This quote really stuck out to me as the counselor was thinking through her process and how she could help him, because one of the concerns that I've always had with working with children is the disappointment with not always being able to take a child out of their reality. Now, the goal with a child is always to keep them safe, but also We know that it's important for a child to stay with the home they know when possible. And so to see a child live in a reality that they themselves cannot change feels very difficult to me. And it's something that I thought this particular quotation really highlighted and showed a lot of wisdom in that her role is not to take him out of his reality and out of his home life. It's rather to give him the skills to work with what he has, and it's up to him to use them or not. I also felt that it was interesting to see that allowing the children to be seen without counseling the parents. Counseling the parents as a prerequisite was not something that I had really been known to see as a potential prerequisite. This was not something that I had known was a thing for people to acquire. But I did see the value in her allowing the parents to come to her when they were ready. In conclusion, I would recommend to anyone pursuing therapy, at any age therapy, to read and learn from this book. It reads like a real life account and is just as educational as a case study would be. I found it insightful and exhilarating to picture myself in the role of working with a child, which was new to me, seeing as I have only ever envisioned working with adults. This was something that I felt challenged by and encouraged by to see how much of an impact you can have on the trajectory of a child's life, even if it is for a short time. This is something that I look forward to taking with me in my life and my career as a counselor. References.